Welcome back to the Inorganic Podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Ayelet Shipley.
Yes.
I'm learning how to say her name. It's really
You've been getting really good at it.
I've had to say it 100 times.
I yell it, I scream it. I yell it, I scream it. Over and over again.
We are here in Austin, Texas at DealCon. This is our second on-site episode, and we just kind of talked a little bit about a wrap-up of all the observations from the conference, but there's one area where we wanted to double-click, and that is on what, Ayelet?
Earnouts.
Yeah,
Our
earnouts. Favorite topic. Lots of discussion about earnouts at the DealCon conference.
Yeah.
Why don't you kick it off?
Yes. This morning we were actually sitting in a round table with individuals that were both experienced acquirers as well as ones that had not acquired yet. And the conversation came up around earnouts and one, what are we typically seeing? What makes a good earnout, or really how do you incentivize a seller to want the business to succeed post-transaction? And earnouts are obviously a big piece of that. So in your mind, where do you see earnouts fitting into why they are common in today's practice?
Yeah. I mean, look, no buyer really wants to deal with the complexity of earnouts, but they are, as a practical matter, required frequently to solve what are fundamentally valuation gaps. That's kind of industry standard knowledge. There are other reasons why earnouts come into play, which is client concentration risk, or you recently acquired a large cohort of really attractive customers and you want to get value for them, even though on a trailing basis they haven't been a big part of revenue. I think another thing that frequently occurs is you're contemplating acquiring a company that has a really large sales pipeline, and they're like, I want credit for the pipeline, and the buyer's like, I want to get this deal closed. And sometimes they use earnout or other mechanisms, but it can be an earnout to essentially close the gap on the unrealized potential of that pipeline. The buyer doesn't like earnouts because it's really hard to document them. There are a lot of ifs, ands, or buts. And it's really interesting that earnouts are essentially designed to allow a seller to capture as much value as possible. However, the practical implementation causes the seller a lot of heartache. And why is that?
Okay, so to track it back for a second, you were like, they want to get credit for their sales pipe.
Right.
The common words I always hear are, okay, I'm in the process, I'm selling my business, but my pipeline is $1 million more than my current revenue is right now. And I know that's what my number is going to be, at the end of the year. So I'll just wait until the end of the year. And buyer's like, okay, well, we'll just use an earnout to bridge that gap, because if you think it, great, no sweat. If you don't, for me, but at least seller feels better about it then. That's where
Exactly.
we see it. But then the heartache comes from when you have an earnout, it can be based on revenue, or it can be based off of EBITDA. And so let's say it's based off of revenue. Okay. So all that the seller wants is to hit their revenue-based earn.
Yeah.
Buyer then, though, is the one who's controlling
the buyer owns the business.
The buyer owns the business. They're controlling what's happening within the business itself. So they get to they can say no to hiring and firing decisions. They can say budget issues, but then that's going to affect the seller's ability to be able to hit their, let's say, revenue base.
And on the other side of that, the challenge can be that very thoughtful and creative sellers can find ways to land outsized deals and sort of inflate revenue or influence revenue through other tactics. And especially in agency, revenue isn't always a great measure of profitability. And so what you're describing is this gap between, I want to get record credit for revenue, or I want to get credit for the profit generated by that revenue, but I don't want you to impede on my ability to run the business to do that. One way to sort of bridge the gap is to do a gross margin based earnout on which you specifically agree what are the already baked in ingredients that are informing gross margin. So gross margin is more predictable on a trailing basis and ultimately flows through the P&L in such a way that when you get to EBITDA, it's there. And it also prevents the scraps over, well, you cut our marketing expenses by $500,000 and now I'm not selling more. Well, we're not benchmarking you on, or you increased our selling cost by $500,000. And now there's less profit on the book. So there's less of these tussles over the lines in themselves. All that said, it still doesn't really solve the problem that they're really hard to negotiate. And then there's another component of earnouts that is the hard part of earnouts, which is what for what business does the seller get credit?
Yeah.
I described a scenario where you have a pipeline that you say you want credit for if it closes in a time frame. And that on the surface is very clear, but then pipeline is constantly changing and shifting. And pipeline sometimes is real and sometimes pipeline is imagined. So you kind of have to put some rails around what clients, what prospects are in the pipeline.
That doesn't really incentivize them to go out then and cross-sell if they're coming into a larger...
Exactly.
Right. So it's like...
And so then in the industrial logic, when you're saying, but we want you to be a part of the bigger ship and you want to take equity,
Which
they're
is
like,
why the whole
where's my
point
credit
of joining the bigger ship.
Yes, yeah, it's the equity. But the thing is like sometimes the prize for what's in the pipeline could be, bigger than the prize for the cross sell, but still there's material cross sell coming through. And so it's like, what is in the pipeline today is what the company that you're acquiring is selling today. Well, what if that pipeline also takes on business from the company that's acquiring the company? Then you have to have a real tough negotiation about where the credit is. And is that credit really towards the larger ship, which is why you're getting equity and why you're becoming a part of the larger ship? Is there executive compensation considerations that you might throw in if you think that the sellers are really good seller, the seller of the company is also a really good seller in the field to prospects and might create more pipeline generation? Or do you have your own sales team that would handle it? There's all these questions. This all comes back to the top, which is buyers really find earnouts difficult, but most of the time are willing to entertain them in order to fill a valuation gap, especially if they have a really great acquisition target in front of them.
Most of our deals have earnouts in the agency role. Like that's what we've seen, especially in uncertain markets.
Yeah.
And in the last year, 18 months, we have 100% seen that, like, not 100% deal, but we've seen that a majority of our agency deals have earnouts because there is always this problem solved, and you do negotiate.
Yeah, but according to a study by Harvard Law, the Harvard Law Review, I think there's like 55 to 60% of earnouts ever get paid at all. So there's like 40 to 45% that don't get paid. And famously, I can talk about this now. It's just one of my software space sort of fan favorites was there was a business called Essential that was run by early novel CEO in the commerce space, Duncan Painter. And he famously would buy these software companies for like 10, 11x of ARR, and they would announce these deals, and it'd be like, you paid $100 million to that company, but then you'd go into the hallways and the water bubblers and talk to people, and they'd be like, it was a $50 million purchase price, and 50 was an earnout. And then I'd talk to people later, and they'd be like, they never got the earnout.
You could inflate the numbers.
Yeah. So it also depends on whether an earnout is going to be achieved, on whether, there's two sides of the table. One is achievability of the earnout as it was set up. And two is the earnout was set up because the seller really believed they could achieve these things. And maybe the seller thought they could do something that it turns out they couldn't. So if you read that stat, you might say, oh, the buyer's trying to be tricky and not pay the earnout. Most of the time, a buyer actually wants to pay an earnout, especially if it ultimately means that the business grew faster.
Right.
There was more profits, there was more success. It's like, why wouldn't you want 100% of earnout to pay 100% of the time if at the end of the day, the ship is much bigger? It does impact the valuation math of the acquisition, but the valuation math is also positively influenced by growth in the business and growth in profitability. So all things should work out. That said, earnouts frequently become so contentious because of the complexity that it actually works against the seller's interests because it has to get so, I don't know, cute for lack of a better
Yeah.
term.
Well, usually what also happens is like people are so fatigued by the end of the deal when they are negotiating their earnout, which is a mistake. And I'll say that in a second.
Yeah.
That then what happens is they're like, okay, I just can't anymore. Let's just get the deal done. Let's do it. I'm sick of arguing about this. But then a year later, now they're angry about
Yeah.
the earnout and the metrics that go into determining if they get it or not. So what we say is negotiate this at the dirt sheet.
Right. Well, if you can, I mean, it's difficult to negotiate it in the term sheet stage. I will argue with that. Like, there's a lot you don't know at the term sheet stage. You haven't done a quality of earnings, so you don't know the full composition of gross margins. You don't really have a full confidence understanding of the financials of the business. Now, if it's a really simple business, you could do it. Or if the company that is selling already has a quality of earnings or a really good audit done, you could conceptualize what the earnout would be based on at a
Right.
high level, but then you'd be like, agree to the details in the next phase of the process.
Obviously.
Yeah.
But you're also like, as a seller, they can go through and look at the things that really they need in order to determine
Yeah.
what would have them hit what they believe their revenue could be, like based off of the earnout that they want.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
And so if they can list out, I need to be able to control, hiring and firing up to X point, or budget within X margin, right? This to this. Then those are like the types of things that sellers could do right now that could help them as kind of they go through the process. So at least they could be having these discussions earlier on before deal fatigue and lawyers are involved and all the things.
I think what you're getting into is sort of, okay, earnouts are hard and there's a lot of complexities to them. Okay, but what should buyers and or sellers, as most of our audience are sellers, can do to put themselves in a position of strength during an earnout negotiation? I think the first point you're making is find as many ways as possible to sort of maintain operational control. Now, operational control, I think, is a great conversation point. Is the entity going to run fully independently on its own 4 feet post-acquisition such that you can reasonably provide operating control to that business? That's not always the case, and that's a tricky one. Even if it is like a subsidiary type of a business, at the end of the day, the investors or whoever owns the company wants to have some level of controls. This comes back to like what we talked about in another episode, which is you really do need to establish a level of trust and a level of understanding that you have a same page view of how you're going to run the business, and that you have agreement on in what forms you're going to settle disagreements. Because if you try to lawyer up the language so much that there's a if then, but this, but that, it likely paints both sides into a corner where it's like, if you really have to do that, you're probably already just telling one another you're going to be in court arguing about this later, which isn't great. So I'm going to guess that given you spend so much time representing the sell side in deals, that you've seen the variation of how this is handled. So practically,
But
what
I
do you
came from
see?
the buyer side before, and
Yeah.
I also represent the buyer side. Like I really do see both. Like
Yeah.
I think I'm leaning towards that right now, maybe because like I don't know, I'm thinking about them more and I feel a little bad.
It's the season of
I
earnouts.
also
Let's just
think
face
I'm
it.
more on the
It's the
sell side right
season of
now than on
earnouts.
the buy side, and I think that's where the split is.
Yeah. It's the season of earnouts. I think like what we were talking about earlier, just to kind of advance a little bit, is there's a really important conversation to be had around recognizing that you're not going to be able to get legally into the agreements every single thing that you want, but having fundamental alignment on some of the basics. Like, number one, you won't materially change the compensation of key employees for X period of time, which is
But
the
you're not going
earnout
to fire
period.
them.
Yeah, or you're not going to fire them. You're not going to constrain my ability to achieve the earnout by removing resources, which again, if you go back to the gross margin measure, it's very convenient because it ultimately accounts for the gross margins before and after. I think it's a very elegant solution in that way. There is, thinking about to what degree you want to be flexible with one another on allocation of resources between the organizations, and how you bill or don't bill or give credit for the contributions of outside actors that were not a part of the selling organization in deals, which again is a little complex. But you could also say, look, every quarter we're going to get together and we're just going to look deal by deal, and we're going to call a spade a spade. And if we feel like we're getting into too many arguments, we have to bring someone independent at both of our cost to deal with this. So we don't really want to do that. But I think, again, it comes back to the cultural element. And I think there's one other point that you were going to make about sellers swinging for the fences and buyers wanting to control for that. Maybe you should expand on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that when you're thinking about an earnout, and I think this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning around saying, well, I think I'm going to hit this much revenue, so I'm going to spend this much in my budget and my marketing spend. And so they're going to do everything they can, but if the buyer is really thinking about the balance sheet of the business, they're thinking about that capital, right? They don't want you to throw off the numbers or inflate the numbers in a way that could then affect the profitability, the EBITDA, the margins of the business when thinking about the organization as a whole.
Yeah.
And I think that's really where it was coming in.
Yeah. There's like a lot of really great thought leadership out there in the podcast universe on, the details of the legal negotiation of earnouts. So I don't think we're trying to cover that ground here. But I think what, this takeaway from DealCon was, it was top of mind because it is a really valuable and common instrument in agency acquisitions. I'm of the mind that, an earnout should not really be more than 15 to at the absolute most 20% of any transaction. So I think, as a guiding principle, agency sellers or buyers should be thinking that is a market range for an earnout capture. And I think the second thing, based off of everything we've seen here, is earnouts are being a valuation, a way to solve for valuation. They require you to get much more upfront about mutual alignment around how you're going to operate together. You can't legally sort out, how you're going to operate together. And so that other commentary we had in our other episode about having shared expectations of how we'll work together.
It's a good exercise to do.
Yeah.
We always say that, like, at the end of the day, the earnout is the cherry on the top, right? Like, when you have a deal in front of you, you have to be happy with the money that you're guaranteed to be getting. And, like, you obviously want that additional cash, but that is going to be the cherry on top. So be happy with the deal that's on the table too.
I think that's a great place to leave it. All right. That's our other insight from DealCon 2025. It was a great experience. I'm really exhausted. I'm looking forward to a very long nap after being in cold rooms and doing a lot of hot networking.
Yeah.
And so thanks for listening to this episode, and we'll catch you on the next one of the Inorganic Podcast.